With the successful launch of Torchwood Series 1, there are a lot of pieces of expanded media, much in line with its parent show Doctor Who. However, most of this expanded media came in fluff pieces on the Torchwood website. One such piece was a fictional document written by James Goss, about a man Torchwood will defrost once a year, give him a day out and then freeze him once more. This story inspired then Doctor Who script editor Helen Rayner to write To the Last Man for Torchwood Series 2, an episode all about a young soldier named Tommy who was frozen by the organisation all the way back in 1918, with the intention of defrosting him one day to save the world from a mysterious time shift. Rayner was also interested in writing a story about Toshiko Sato, who was one of her favourite characters in the show, so it was decided that she would go on an emotional journey alongside Tommy throughout the episode. To the Last Man has always received mixed views from critics, with many praising the characters, but criticising the use of plot devices, and the similarity to episodes like Out of Time and Captain Jack Harkness in Series 1. However, Rayner had brought a lot to the show by kickstarting Owen's character growth with Ghost Machine, so does this Tosh-centric episode do enough with the characters to make it stand out? Or does it deserve to slip through the time shifts of obscurity? Well, grab your Rift key and jump into a freezer, because it's time to take a look at To the Last Man.
He's a frozen soldier from 1918.
Nobody's perfect.
In my review of Captain Jack Harkness, I mentioned how timey-wimey it was with its use of skipping through time and sending messages across the decades. To the Last Man continues this kind of Moffat-y science fiction storytelling, with an in media res opening as a very posh Torchwood team from 1918 investigate mysterious ghosts and happenings within a hospital. As Doctor Who showed us in Tooth and Claw, the Torchwood Institute has been around since 1879, but up to this point we'd only seen the organisation in the present day. It was a shame because of that long history always being hinted at but never shown. It's a sprawling organisation throughout time, and I'm glad Big Finish would later delve much deeper into that history, thanks to the Torchwood main range. To the Last Man finally decided to give us that glimpse into the past of the organisation, and I just really appreciate it since it shows that some things never change within the group regardless of the time, along with it exploring more of Torchwood's past like Fragments and Exit Wounds would also do. However, we're then whipped around in time as we see Tosh and Tommy, who Torchwood 1918 just saw, immediately establishing there's something very wrong with time. It's a brilliant setup for an episode, this chaotic opening the viewer has no understanding of, throwing you into the deep end with a wonderful mystery to unpack and piece together.
Who are you? We're Torchwood.
With the way Torchwood Series 1 was structured, each member of the team had their own dedicated episode to explore them as characters and flesh them out, with Yanto having Cyberwoman, Tosh having Greeks bearing gifts, and so on. This narrative structure continues with Series 2 since this episode is all about Toshiko, one of the most undeveloped members of the cast. The focus is immediately noticeable as she goes through her morning routine in her fancy new flat, which looks a lot more swish than her place in Series 1. I really like Tosh, she's one of the more likeable members of the team, so I appreciate that she's the first in Series 2 to get a dedicated episode, because the others were already developed enough, barring Yanto. The reason she's so happy is because today is their annual Wake Up a Cryogenically Frozen Soldier Day, although they probably prefer the Wake Up a Cryogenically Frozen Multimedia Tycoon Dictator Day. No, I'm not dropping the idea that Torch would have Walt Disney tucked away somewhere in the hub. Indeed, as the beginning established, they have Tommy frozen in the hub and wake him up once a year to check on him, since they know they need him one day. It's an absolutely fantastic premise for a storyline. Imagine it, you're given one day every year to live your life. It'd be this eclectic mix of disorientation and wonder, as you see so many rapid advancements in the blink of an eye, but you never truly live them because you only get one day. It's the kind of storytelling Torchwood lends itself to so well, because they immediately get into the reality of it all, as he perfectly recites his own biography and the death of his father, which happened just 80 odd days ago for him, despite it being decades before any of the Torchwood team were even born. So it's a quick way to establish that bittersweet tone of the episode and the yearly wake up concept. After a false alarm of Tommy almost dying and having a frenzied scuffle, they wake him up for his one day of freedom. I think it's a good touch that he doesn't just wake up all fine and dandy. He's been cryogenically frozen for an entire calendar year. It's not exactly a surprise that his stop-start life would make him a bit jittery and confused. I also think it's good that Helen Raynor uses Gwen as an audience surrogate to walk us through what's going on with the whole situation. Since Gwen is still in her first year of being with Torchwood, this is the first time she's had to experience this protocol, so she's there to ask the same questions the audience would be asking. Jack explains it all to Gwen, walking her through the threat of the time shifts. This danger reminds me a lot of End of Days. Time colliding together and leaking across the dimensions to threaten all of existence. I guess the similarities make it immediately understandable as to why this is a big deal, because we saw exactly how dangerous it was when the rift was opened. So we know what to expect if Torchwood fails here. Although they themselves are in the dark as to what they even need to do to prevent it when the moment comes. They just know they need Tommy for something, even though Torchwood 1918 sealed their orders with a rather convenient temporal lock that'll only open when the plot decrees it.
It's a temporal lock, tied in with the rift frequencies at the hospital.
Tosh is essentially Tommy's chaperone. She takes him out to go see the outside world once a year, even though for him it's every single day. I think it really puts everything into perspective when Tommy talks about Captain Scott, who sailed for Antarctica in 1910 before dying on the continent in 1913, ultimately becoming a British hero for discovering fossils in the ice that proved Antarctica was connected to the other continents millions of years earlier. To Tosh and the viewer, it's old history, events from a century ago which only live on in memoirs and statues. But for Tommy, it's his reality. He saw the papers at the time, he followed the story. It was all completely real to him, like when we look at the news and see current events in our own time. I just think it's a good way to show how out of time and far away from his world he is. The scene also explores how Tosh only ever focuses on work and never allows herself a social life. She never lets herself learn new things or to experience anything outside of this work, even now she's on the clock. I for one think this is immensely relatable because, I basically sacrificed my entire social life for work. But it says a lot about Tosh as a realistic person and how dedicated she really is to Torchwood. It's interesting that Tommy points out she wasn't conscripted, kind of a hint towards her origin story in fragments, where we find out she joined Torchwood to escape a slow and isolated death inside a unit blacksite prison. It's not surprising she'd put 110% of her life into her Torchwood work, because she knows the alternative is much worse.
You talk about your life like you've got no control over it.
Tommy's existence also leads to some smart commentary about humanity's constant warring and how desensitized we are to it by this point. As he says, World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It obviously wasn't called World War I at the time. It was merely the Great War, since it was unprecedented at the time and they thought it couldn't get any worse. But as Tommy's weeks go by, he sees World War II, the Cold War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and now the Iraq War, along with many others in between.
Seems like there's always a war somewhere.
Without sounding like the Joker or some edgy Redditor, Western society has devalued the horrific realism of war, and we turn a blind eye to the conflicts constantly going on across the world, because they feel so far away. But even though we only see it through the lens of the news every now and then, there are millions of people facing the same kinds of horrors Tommy faced back in the Great War. So you can definitely see where he's coming from when he wonders if we as a race are even worth saving if we never actually learn our lesson. The Torchwood team are always fighting their own wars against aliens, so there are some parallels between Tosh and Tommy. They're able to bond over how their lives have been changed so drastically that they can't form meaningful relationships. In Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Tosh and Owen talked about how hard it is for them to date because of their Torchwood lifestyles. She has a similar scene with Tommy, who went through the First World War. It changed him, and made it impossible for him to date his then girlfriend Ellie. It's a good scene for drawing those parallels between the two characters and also bringing them closer together as romantic partners, since they do have things in common.
Right pair we make.
Tosh and Tommy having these isolating and alien lives in common means I don't think them kissing comes out of the blue. Sure, they only interact one day a year, so Tommy has only known her for 4 days of his life. But at the beginning we saw how much Tosh looks forward to this day each year, so the potential for her falling for him was always there. Also, he's the closest thing we see to a social life for Tosh, so I don't think it comes as a surprise that they develop romantic feelings for one another.
I can be myself with him. Don't have to pretend.
An important note Helen Raynor wanted to explore was how their relationship was a so-called pretend relationship, because Tosh only sees Tommy once a year. Raynor wanted her to learn that Tommy can't be treated like a toy, which I think is a good layer to the story that adds a lot to the intricacies of their dynamic, because he's just as much of a person as she is, which leads to her developing more of an appreciation of him. However, as tends to be the case with Torchwood, Tosh's romance once again gets wrecked, as she has to take Tommy back to the hub now that the time shift is about to happen. Indeed, Jack knows today is the day, and he gives a good explanation with a piece of paper.
Okay. Linear time. Screwed up time.
Thank God he didn't fold it over and do the black hole thing everyone always does. Throughout the episode, the stakes have slowly been rising, and this is another example of that. A sudden stab of urgency right into the heart of the episode. Earlier on, Gwen went to the hospital and started seeing ghosts from 1918, similar to Captain Jack Harkness, where there are brief glimpses here and there of the dance hall in the past. However, I can't help but feel as though the scene ends up a bit goofy. It starts off all eerie and sinister enough, and then the music swells and Gwen gets all scared, but the soldier has one leg and is on crutches. She could easily overpower him if he was real, so I don't understand why she's so scared of him. I just think it's a weird moment that's tonally off. It rightfully sets off alarm bells for Torchwood though, as Jack investigates too, suggesting the mental trauma of the wounded soldiers mixes with the rift to create the time shifts. The First World War was a truly horrifying conflict to fight in, because it was unlike any other before it. There were so many new types of weapons that neither side had any experience with, and chemical weapons were an ever-present threat to everyone. One day you could be cleaning your rifle in a trench a few miles from the front line, and suddenly everyone around you is wiped out by mustard gas, and you're blinded with blistered skin, living every day in agony, before you're immediately shipped right back into the fight as soon as you're even the slightest bit fit. Every account of the war makes it sound more and more like a hellish nightmare, so it's definitely fitting that the pain of these soldiers would resonate with the rift, like how people believe hauntings are linked to the negative emotions of where the people died, hence all the ghosts apparently hanging out in prisons and old mental hospitals. As Jack and Gwen both experience ghosts, a nurse from 1918 notices her as well. This is a fantastically chilling way to up the ante. It always gives me goosebumps. They're ghosts in each other's worlds, both as scared as each other because this shouldn't be happening. It signifies how much worse the time shifts are becoming, since it's no longer one way.
Have you seen any recently? Ghosts?
I've seen 3 today. It's getting worse.
The future is also bleeding into the past, rather than the other way around like it was before. I just think it's a sublime escalation of the tension and threat of the story.
Why won't you leave us alone? You shouldn't be here! Don't mean you any. You shouldn't be here!
Torchwood's worst fears begin to come true as the team realise the time shift begins right now. Everything is lining up and even the sealed orders open, truly signifying the beginning of the end. It's time to finally find out what Tommy's role in all of this is. It turns out that when the time shift is in full swing, Tommy has to cross over to 1918 to mend the fractures and return both 1918 and himself to where it belongs. Jack makes it sound all heroic and romantic, but the reality is Tommy is going back into hell, losing all these days to go back into the war, even though he knows it's close to ending. However, the reality is much worse than this. Since they're in the future, Jack knows exactly what will happen to Tommy when he returns. Just 3 weeks after going back, Tommy will be executed for so-called cowardice because he suffers from shell shock. This is another major reason why World War I was so horrific. Even if you weren't killed by the enemy, you could be killed by your own people for the dastardly crime of suffering from PTSD. The treatment of soldiers is one of the single most abhorrent acts of the British military during the First World War. They were so firmly ignorant of the condition that they considered it a weakness, and their steps to cure it ranged from cigarettes on the tongue to electric shocks because they believed they could simply revert these men back to their heroic selves. It's a truly horrific part of the war that often gets overlooked, so it makes Tommy's fate even more tragic, since he single-handedly saves all of time, just to be executed for being a supposed coward. However, it's not just Tommy who has to go. Tosh also has to be there when the time shift happens. It essentially gives her this painful decision to make. She has to send him to his death. Even though she and Tommy sleep together on his final night in the future, she still can't shake this lingering guilt for what will happen to him. It's hard to lie to someone about something like that, pretending they'll be fine. Tosh is timid enough that it would be obvious, so I respect her for just coming out and letting him know. I can't imagine how tough it is for both characters. I'm surprised Tommy managed to fall asleep at all, knowing he only has hours left of all his memories and experiences. The team then return to the hospital to send Tommy back. I genuinely understand his fear and refusal to go. It's a really sad scene because he's facing his own mortality. I don't at all think he's selfish for being angry that he's the one that has to go. It's a very human response to such a situation. He wanted no part of this. He was essentially conscripted into this role, just like he was conscripted into the army. He has had no say in his life, and now he's being sent to his death. You really can't blame him for reacting this way. It's immensely relatable, all communicated with one simple line.
I don't want to be a hero.
I also like that he calls out Captain Jack, who makes all these decisions about who lives and who dies, when he himself is immortal, so he doesn't remember how it feels anymore.
You are no better than the generals. Sitting safely behind the lines, sending us over the top.
It's been so many deaths since the game station, he probably can't remember what it's like to face legitimate consequences for self-sacrifice, so he just forces it onto others, highlighting the flaws of a character like Jack, who has become so out of touch with humanity. However, Tosh is the sympathetic person Tommy trusts and loves, so she steps in to convince him since he won't listen to anyone else. It's the right way to go, using this strong bond we've seen throughout to give Tommy the courage to embrace his destiny and mortality after all he's been through. The music is superb as they part ways, and Naoko Mori is fantastic. You really feel and empathise with Tosh's sadness at sending him away, yet another false hope for a relationship. Torchwood ripping away her personal life once more as she watches him march into his death, almost like going over the trenches into battle for the last time. It's such a tragic and heartbreaking scene. Tommy then replaces his original self, who is taken away to be frozen by Torchwood, and continuing the cycle since this is essentially one big time loop now. However, because the episode needs another injection of stakes and tension, the time shift doesn't stop, plunging the team into chaos as the past starts to erupt all around them. Despite these sudden high stakes, Owen figures out a solution because the script needed to give him something to do. They decide that the volatility of the time shifts can be exploited to send an image back in time to convince Tommy to use the key. Initially, as he loves to do, Jack tries to take responsibility and do it, but Tosh stops him because Tommy trusts her above anyone else. It takes a lot of bravery for Tosh to step up like this and assume this responsibility because not only is she taking the entire planet's lives into her hands, she's also forcing herself to say goodbye to Tommy once again, for the last time. So it's a very brave act by her. It turns out the reason Tommy hasn't used the key isn't out of fear, it's because he no longer has his memory, so he doesn't even know what to do with it. Tosh has to convince him all over again. The scene is a perfectly heartbreaking ending, which is what Raina was intending with it. Due to the ignorance of the people around him in 1918, Tommy is so convinced he's a coward, because of his shell shock, but Tosh knows exactly what he's capable of. I suppose in a way it makes it easier for him to use the key, because he doesn't actually know what he went through with the freezing and once a year lifestyle. But that all makes it harder for Tosh to say goodbye now he's a shadow of the man she loved. It's truly bittersweet, especially because he'll never know what he did, and all the lives he saved. He'll still die thinking he's a coward, and it just crushes you to watch unfold.
All this time I've had, it means nothing.
Now that the world and time itself is saved, Tosh still has to grapple with seeing Tommy go for the last time, knowing there will never be a next year, he's gone forever. It's another emotional moment for her, using the post-action to remind you that these characters don't just cease to exist the moments the credits roll. They're constantly dealing with the aftermath of their experiences and their struggles. We do get to see the sweet side of the bittersweet moment though, since Owen goes to Tosh to comfort her and tell her just how important she and Tommy were with what they did. It's a touching final scene to bring Owen and Tosh closer as people, but I can't help but feel like this post-action needed just a little bit longer to truly achieve that intent. They don't interact enough at the end here, which I think is a shame. I'm not sure what the episode could have cut out from earlier to accommodate this longer epilogue, but I do think it needs to have more time to build up those Tosh and Owen character beats more effectively. Earlier on there had been a perfect moment between the pair in the hospital. Owen himself had a similar out-of-time romance since he fell for and then lost Diane to the Rift. He, more than anyone, knows the dangers of developing feelings for someone like this, so he can relate to Tosh. It was only a brief scene between the pair, but it's the perfect use for Owen. It serves this dual purpose by calling upon his past development, at the same time as laying more groundwork for their will they won't they storyline to come, especially as he shows a rare piece of sensitivity towards Tosh.
I just, don't want you to get hurt.
The personal setup in the scene is what makes me wish the final scene spent more time with the pair, but sadly that isn't the case and the epilogue is weaker as a result. When you break it down, To the Last Man is kind of like a spiritual successor to the series 1 episode Out of Time. They're very similar episodes with their setup and how they explore the main characters involved. Owen had his passionate but short-lived relationship with Diane, and Tosh has this sudden relationship with Tommy ripped away from her. Out of Time is much more acclaimed, but I do think To the Last Man is almost just as good. It's an amazing character piece for Tosh, really delving into her as a person, and how Torchwood completely rules her life. Maury brings the role to life with a wonderfully bittersweet portrayal as she goes through this journey of love and loss. I will admit I don't fully buy into her and Tommy as a couple because they don't have much chemistry, but you still feel the tragedy at the end. I also think the time shift concept is brilliant and a great way to play with time travel, using similar concepts as Out of Time and Captain Jack Harkness but with a new and interesting twist to maintain the more dramatic stakes Torchwood Series 2 is playing with. I think I'd put To the Last Man at a B rank on the tier list. There are some weak moments throughout and there are a lot of convenient plot devices, but the whole team is involved well and there are some interesting scenes touching on Jack's own past and identity as a man out of his own time. I appreciate the dips into Torchwood's past as an organisation, and the exploration of the human condition as a warring species is a good consequence of the story being set up how it is, along with that brief but vital look at the ignorance of shell shock back in 1918. Overall, To the Last Man is a tragic, human story about love and sacrifice, merely using science fiction as a backdrop, which is exactly what it needed to be, showing just how flexible Torchwood can be when it really focuses on the people involved. And I'd like to give an extra special thank you to all my gold level patrons: Alex Marston, Calvin, Daniel Shillito, Fowler Cortez, Franz Horn aka Line Vortex, George, John, Stephen Evan Miller and William Jewell. Thank you so much for your support.